Perfect. Can you hear and see me? I was having a little technical difficulties with the new Facebook Live. I think we have a Kathy who just posted. Can we have like a thumbs up or something to let me know you can hear me? Great. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this Facebook Live to discuss the episode from Oxygen dealing with Ellen's case. And my name is Guy DeAndrea, and I wanted to thank everyone now for submitting so many questions that truly show that you have an interest and a desire for justice, as well as to have the questions that Oxygen, it's not that they couldn't answer, but given the time constraints, that we can hopefully now address through this Facebook Live. One of the preliminary things I wanted to address is something that was raised in some of the posts, and I did receive some emails as well as about this, and it dealt with basically who am I and what relation, if any, do I have to the family of Ellen and whether or not I am their attorney. I will tell you that I'm not the family's attorney. I did not know Ellen or the family prior to getting involved in an investigation in some capacity in this case in or around 2014 or 15. I am not hired by the family to do this. I'm a former homicide prosecutor in Philadelphia, and I reviewed Ellen's case several years after her death. Again, I don't remember specifically, but around 2014 or 2015. So I have reviewed the entire case file. All the evidence that was gathered or lack thereof, I'm aware of from my review of the file for several months, if not years, while I was at the district attorney's office. And so I think I can answer a lot of the questions that many of you posted that come from a factual or evidentiary standpoint. And so these are in no particular order. I sort of made a list of some of the questions, and I don't know whether it'll be in a sort of coherent timeline, but in other words, I just want to address the questions as I copied and pasted them from the individuals who put them up. I also want to say that if anybody has questions, I'll do my best to follow up with them as they come in on the thread. So one of the first questions it dealt with computer searches, and it says, how do they know it was her and not him? This is huge because who else besides him or her would search on her computer weeks before? This is all about him and or her or her. He needs, okay. So in other words, it deals with the issue of the computer searches that dealt with the information that was provided on the Oxygen network that indicated that Ellen or someone had searched for pain-free or painless ways to commit suicide. Here's what I'll tell you about the computer and what was or was not contained in the original case file. So first, when I reviewed the case file, and again, I had it for months, if not years, I mean, closer to years, actually, before I left the district attorney's office, there were no computer searches at all. So not that there were computer searches that showed suicide or not suicide, there just weren't any searches in that file. So one of the questions I've always had since leaving the office is, now that these searches have come out, it's who performed them, where were they performed, how were they performed, and a lot of other questions concerning that particular topic. So that's not a great answer in terms of who did the searches, but I have a lot of questions about that as well, because again, that was not contained in my file. So I would like to know where those searches came from as well. What I can tell you about the computer is that on the scene, after Ellen was found and the police were notified and arrived, the electronics were given to, which was a computer and several other electronic devices, they were returned to, or not returned to, but rather given to Ellen's fiance at the time, as well as his family. I don't know why that was done. It wasn't documented in the file why that was done. I don't know why that was done. I never got a good answer for that. I will tell you that those devices were ultimately turned back over to the Philadelphia Police Department several days after they were given to the fiance and his family. And so what does that mean from a legal perspective? Well, there's a couple of things that I did want to address, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds with this, but there is, and I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence, but there is a concept in criminal law that's called chain of custody. And what that means is when the police recover evidence from any scene, they have to maintain that evidence, and they have to create a log of where it was, who touched it, when they touched it. So it's not just about whether or not a civilian touched it, but the log has to include everyone within the chain. In other words, who had that evidence. So think about this as an analogy. If a police officer on a homicide shooting death arrives and they find a gun, and this would not happen, but you would at least hope, but just for sake of example, if they turn that gun over to a civilian on the street, and then several days later that person dropped the gun back off and they fingerprinted it and did DNA checks on it, and then it turned out to come back to Joe Smith. We'll use that as an example. Well, if they arrested Joe Smith, that fingerprint evidence and that DNA evidence would not be admissible because for 3 or 4 days, that gun was not in the possession of Philadelphia Police Department. There would be no accountability as to who touched it, when they touched it, how they touched it. So in other words, if you are going to use reliable and credible evidence, it must maintain its integrity, which is the chain of custody, and it was broken here. I hope I addressed that fully. If anyone has any additional questions, please let me know. Physical evidence. One of the things, and this goes again with the computer, so I'm trying to stick in order here, at least to some extent. Why wasn't anyone who removed the items, such as the computer or electronic devices, not charged with obstruction? Again, if the items were given to the family by the authorities, then they can't be charged with obstruction because it was given to them. So there would be no tampering and there would be no obstruction because, it shouldn't have been given to them. Let's be clear about that. But the fact that it was means that they had the authority to have it, so there can't be any tampering. If the police could get a search warrant now, would luminol still show blood splatter, or has it been too long? Well, I put this question here. I know it's not technically dealing with the computer, but it's a similar type concept. Whether it would still show blood or not, there is a chance. Potentially unlikely, but there would be a chance. However, it's the same concept as dealing with the chain of custody being broken with the computer and the electronic devices. In other words, if they did a luminol test and it showed that there was at one point the presence of blood, well, it's been 9 years, and who knows how many people have lived in that apartment. So you can imagine that an argument could be made that, if not a strong one, that if there is blood detected, how do we know who and where and how it got there? And how do we know it would belong to Ellen versus anyone else who may have injured themselves in that kitchen? Now, that might seem implausible, but the fact remains that that evidence 9 years later, even if it were to be able to be found, would not really bear any weight in court because of the length of time and the amount of people who had lived in that particular apartment. So it wouldn't be reliable at that point in time, regardless whether it showed the presence of blood or not. I will say, addressing the luminol, in a perfect world, that should have been done on the day of Ellen's death. Just so everyone understands, and luminol, and this is a very simplistic way to explain it, but essentially think of a black light, and if they shine that black light on an object, it will display if there was the presence of blood in a particular location, whether or not that blood had been cleaned with a chemical or a bleach or whatnot. It would show that there was in fact blood present and that someone, with using some form of chemical, did in fact clean that blood up. And so the frustrating thing is, if the luminol testing had been done and it did show the presence of blood and that was cleaned up in or around where Ellen was found and where her body had laid, then I would argue, if I think anyone would argue, that that would be conclusive evidence of a homicide. In other words, if there was the presence of someone cleaning the blood up, that means someone had killed her and then someone had cleaned up after the fact. So that would have been, or could have been, a crucial piece of evidence that could have put to rest whether or not this was a suicide or a homicide, right? So that's a frustrating thing for me as an attorney. I cannot even imagine. Frustration is probably not the word, and I don't want to speak for the family, but to know that that could have been done, and had it been done, and had it shown blood, it would have put to rest this idea of whether this was a suicide or homicide back 9 years ago. And if they did the luminol test and it didn't show blood, that doesn't make it conclusively a suicide, but finding blood would make it conclusively a homicide. So that question, again, very frustrating that it cannot be answered. It's too late. There's some questions about a timeline, and the questions are, among other things, what time did Ellen get home from work? Was her fiance home when she got home? Or was that when he was at the gym? So Ellen had, from my review of the file, Ellen was at work that day, but it had snowed. And so she was, like all the other teachers at that school, were released early for early dismissal and arrived home, if I remember correctly, is sometime before 1 p.m. It may have even been earlier than that. And her fiance at the time, for a length of time, was in fact home with her prior to going to the gym. And so there were questions about whether or not her fiance did in fact go to the gym or not go to the gym. What I can tell you is I did review, there are some video in this particular apartment complex. The video does not show, unfortunately, the hallway where Ellen lived, but the video does show the entrance to the facility as well as the corridor or the hallway leading into the gym. It's not a fantastic video, but it does show that. In addition to that, you need a key fob to enter the building, and if I remember correctly, you need a key fob to enter the gym. And I remember looking at, if I recall properly, and I think that I am, that both the video surveillance as well as the key fob does show him going into the gym in or around 5:01 p.m. He was at the gym for approximately 30 minutes, give or take. So leaves the apartment around 5, maybe 4:59, 5 p.m., takes the elevator downstairs, goes to the gym, and is there for approximately 29 or 30 minutes, and then returns back to the apartment. Was there anyone inside of the gym? That's a good question. There was no evidence that I had that anyone else was inside of the gym. So I don't know whether there was or wasn't, but no one came forward. And I had video up until a certain amount of time prior to him entering the gym, and no one else had entered in or around that time. So whether there was someone there for a length of period prior to him entering, I don't know that, but there is no evidence that we had at the time, or even now, no one's ever come forward that anybody else was in the gym. Was there a witness to Sam kicking in the door? Was the security guard present? Has come up a lot. And so what we have in terms of what we had, or what's contained in the investigation, is the security guard did in fact give a statement. And I don't recall his name, but even if I did, I wouldn't mention it because I think he deserves privacy in this matter unless he wants to come forward. But what I do remember is that, what I know is that he gave a statement, and he conclusively stated in his signed statement to Philadelphia homicide detectives that he did not go upstairs. In other words, he was not there when the door when entry was made into the apartment. There were some neighbors who lived on that floor who did give statements as well. And they had indicated that for approximately an hour, hour and 10 minutes, give or take, they did hear, with the exception of when Sam went downstairs to speak with the security guard, they did hear banging, they heard yelling from Sam into the apartment to have the door opened. But my recollection is that someone may have come out for a minute or two, but there was no evidence, no statements that anyone was outside when entry was made into the apartment. And I think we have a question that popped up. Okay, so there's a global question. Can you tell me, Guy, why there was no real investigation into her fiance, and how could she stab herself that many times after she cut her spinal cord? Her body would not be able to move. That is a great question, and it's a global question. So the person who posted that, I asked, just bear with me a little bit, and I promise I think some of these answers will get to that, but I will circle back to that as a sort of an overview as well. there is a question. I think was the apartment ever treated as a crime scene at all? I mean, it was in the extent that crime scene unit did arrive. The medical examiner's office arrived. It was photographed. It wasn't, I can tell you from my experience as a homicide prosecutor, it wasn't treated with the level that an investigation would be treated if viewed by the authorities as a homicide on scene. Why it wasn't, with upwards of 20 stab wounds and a laceration to the head, I don't have a good answer for that. But it was treated as a crime scene, but I wouldn't say that it was treated to the level that you would see from, let's say someone shot 10 times right on the street. That's clearly a homicide. And I'm not saying that this is or isn't. I'm just saying when that happens, there's things that are done differently. Is there still a recording of the 911 call? And the person says, I'm very surprised it wasn't played on the program. What I can tell you is that the 911 phone call is 100% or was 100% in my case file, or in the case file. I shouldn't call it mine, but in the case file in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. The 911 call, I know there's been a lot of questions about that. I had listened to that 911 phone call probably 4, 5, 6 dozen times, literally. It's approximately 5.5 minutes long, give or take a couple of seconds. The information on the 911 phone call, among other things, is that when the fiance walks into the room, when he makes entry into the apartment, he calls 911, at least that's what it says on the 911 phone call. And he is describing, or it's being described, what is sort of what's happening in the apartment. And it's Ellen is unconscious. There is blood. There is no immediate information about any stab wounds, albeit almost 20, if not more. And it was approximately 3 minutes, 15 seconds, give or take, where finally information is given to the 911 operator that there is a knife sticking out of Ellen's chest. So the information on the 911 phone call at 3 minutes and 10 or 15 seconds, it almost seems like a surprise that this 10, 12-inch knife or butcher knife sticking out of Ellen's chest. The information in terms of the location of Ellen's body from the 911 phone call is that Ellen was in a laid down position with her sort of back on the ground and her chest up. The police, when they arrive, found, per the police reports, Ellen's body in a seated position. There was no information that anybody moved the body, but at least from the 911 phone call, she is being described as in a laid down position. And then when the police arrive, she's in a seated position. How that happened, why that happened, I don't know. That wasn't contained in the file. I will say what would be strange from an evidentiary standpoint is if at one point she was laying down with her head on the ground, Ellen had a significant amount of blood that had pooled into her hair from the large laceration to the top of her head. One would expect to see, I suppose anything is possible, but one would expect to see when you have that much blood coming from the head, which is one of the parts of the body that bleeds the most, regardless of the size of the wound, you would expect to have seen, some smeared type blood or some type of evidence where her head that had been bleeding was laying, and that was not seen. There was, or not found rather. That did not exist. There was some blood that had pooled close to the body, but there wasn't what you would expect to see if the body was in a laid down position. And so that phone call was made to 911 approximately an hour or so, over an hour after her fiance got back from the gym and ultimately gained entry into the apartment. There was questions about whether the drains were checked. The drains were not, there was no evidence that drains were checked. Their trash wasn't checked. The dumpster wasn't checked. At least nothing in my file indicated that. So if that was done, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that it wasn't documented. there's a question about bruising and that Ellen had different stages of healing, or bruises in different stages of healing, and what to make of that. Well, that is accurate. There were a tremendous amount of bruises that were inflicted all over Ellen's body, primarily, if not exclusively, in areas that you would not see if you were otherwise dressed, right? So it was the chest, the thighs, the legs, the back, things along those, or the front of her body that would be covered with a dress, a blouse, a shirt. And so the bruising from the medical examiner's perspective, in my review of the photographs, were, again, that they were inflicted over a period of time, going as far back as a couple of days, if not weeks. There was some opining by the forensic pathologist that those bruises certainly could have been caused by someone else, but they also could have been caused by contact sports. I don't dispute him that if you play contact sports and you're not properly protected, or even if you are, that there's a potential for you to have bruising from that contact sport. Ellen didn't play contact sports. Ellen was a first grade teacher. And so while that's possible that someone could get them from contact sports, that's fine to say that, but she didn't play contact sports. And so if she didn't play contact sports, they didn't come from contact sports. And there earlier, I don't know if, I cannot remember if it was Oxygen or a separate coverage, there was information that someone, and I almost can't even take this seriously, that Ellen could have obtained those from intense workouts. And I don't fully know what that means in terms of how you would have so many bruises over so many parts of your body from working out. Logic would seem to dictate that if you are working out in a way that you are causing bruising to yourself, after maybe a couple of times you would adjust whatever that workout is. But there was no information that Ellen worked out in an extreme fashion. So the bruising that was attributable to contact sports potentially, or extreme workouts, that didn't happen here. So the bruises had to come from something else. There's a question is, could the bruises have been self-inflicted? Sure. I mean, you could punch yourself, you can slam yourself or your body into objects and obtain those bruises. I suppose that's more logical than the contact sports, because she didn't play contact sports. But again, Ellen would have had to punch, beat, slam herself into objects for days or weeks on end to obtain that many bruises in that many stages of healing. Was there ever proof that the swing lock was engaged? Did the security guard say he actually saw it? Because the lock looked hardly damaged at all. And I agree, the lock did look hardly damaged. I will tell you this, again, the security guard did not see the locking mechanism before the door was kicked in, if we stay with that idea that the door was kicked in. He didn't come upstairs. What happened was, in terms of a timeline, when Sam could not get into the apartment, at least from what the evidence showed, after some period of time, he does go downstairs and speaks with the security guard. The security guard was asked if there was a device that the apartment complex had that would allow someone like a security guard to gain entry into the apartment when the deadbolt, or the slide lock, really it's not a deadbolt, when the slide lock is engaged. The security guard advised him that there was no such tool, and there was a discussion about, well, how do I get in then? And then there was a discussion about, what if I kick the door in? And it was left off by the security guard telling him that if he kicks a door in, I mean, he can do whatever he wants, but obviously he's going to have to pay or fix that after it's kicked in immediately, if not prior to moving out, for certain. So no, he did not see that. The lack of damage to the door is of note. There's no question about it. There was questions about whether that was attempted to be recreated. It wasn't. Could it be recreated? I'm sure. I mean, I would think you'd have to do it multiple times using the same type of door, using the exact same locking mechanism, to try at least to replicate what would happen to the door if you did that. Again, and also I think it would be determinative, or what would need to happen is the similar, if not the same type of force that was used in terms of opening the door, to establish whether or not you would expect to see that locking mechanism come off the hinges, or at least off the wall where it locks in. And that did not happen in this particular instance. And my recollection is the screws were actually, while certainly loosened, were still intact in or around the holes in which the locking mechanism was placed into the door frame. There's a question about, there was reference on the Oxygen network that there was a balcony, and there was a balcony, and it was not the first floor, so someone had to climb up. And whether or not there was or there wasn't footprints in the snow, I can assure you that at least as to that aspect, the terrace, the balcony, was in fact photographed, and there was not, at least in the photographs I viewed, and I have no reason to doubt that they were not taken on the day of, there were no footprints in that snow. There was no evidence that anyone had been out in the balcony. Were people in the apartment complex questioned? How do we know that someone else didn't enter the apartment when Sam left and attacked her from behind while she was slicing fruit? Well, people in the apartment complex were interviewed, and I did review the logs of the apartment complex. There was no evidence that anyone who, other than residents of that apartment, had come or gone that particular day in or around the time or anything leading up to Ellen's death. So it wasn't a stranger. If you believe that, or if you want to sort of go down the theory of could this have been something else, again, I mean, I guess facts are stranger than fiction, they say, but if you believe that or think that, this is what would had to have happened for that to have occurred. The attacker could not have possibly known, I can't imagine how, if or when anyone was going to leave to go to the gym. So when Sam left to go to the gym, the attacker within 29 minutes would have had to have been able to enter the apartment, blitz attack Ellen, stab her a countless number of times, 20 times, not countless, arguably clean up, think about locking the door from the outside to make it look like it was a suicide, and have the wherewithal to do all that within 20 or so minutes. And so I don't know that that's a plausible theory. I mean, again, anything is possible, but I don't think that's a theory that would bear any fruit if this were investigated as a homicide. Did the police take any photographs of her and or the fiance right after the death? They did take a tremendous amount of photographs of Ellen. They did not take any photographs of him. Was there ever a lie detector test offered to the fiance? No. Again, this was ruled by the Philadelphia Police Department as a suicide. I know that it was ultimately changed several days later as a homicide by the medical examiner's office to only create more confusion, to then be changed back again to a suicide. But once the police department ruled it a suicide, there would at least arguably be no reason to conduct a lie detector test because it wasn't being viewed as someone had done this to Ellen. Was the fiance interviewed? He was interviewed. There was some confusion about that I saw on the Facebook thread. He was in fact interviewed. He did give a formal statement to the police department. At that statement, he did have an attorney present, not his family member. He had a criminal defense attorney present with him during the interview. It was a short and sweet interview that reiterated essentially everything I've said in terms of Ellen already said. Ellen had come home early from work because of early dismissal. He went to the gym. He came home. He came back. The door was locked. He tried to gain entry. Hour or so later, kicked the door in, found her that way, and called the police. I'm clearly paraphrasing, but that was the gist. It was not a very long statement at all. Okay. And so that was, I think that addressed a lot of the primary questions. And I know I've seen a lot of questions post up, and I know there's a lot. Okay. So I wanted to answer sort of generally the questions that came up, and I try to condense a lot of them because a lot of them dealt with very similar topics. And so let me walk everyone through in a more linear fashion, and maybe some of you might say, why didn't you just do this from the beginning? But I did want to address your question specifically. And so let's walk through sort of what I found, what I saw when I did this particular investigation. And so again, I had no idea who Ellen and her family were. I didn't know, quite frankly, I at the time when Ellen was, at the time of Ellen's death, I was in major crimes. I was doing non-fatal shootings. And so I did not have an appreciation for, nor did I know really too much about Ellen's case. And so ultimately, when I made it to the homicide unit, years into that, I was asked to review this file, and I did that. And one of the things that I primarily started with, I do this in any investigation, whether it's a suicide, suspicious death, or homicide. If I'm looking into something, I treat every case the same way. And so I got the file and I pulled out all of the evidence. I sorted it in a way that made sense to me. I created my folders and I went through every single piece of evidence multiple times and created charts and whatnot and listened to the 911 phone call. And ultimately, I wanted to know, before going, even further into it, sort of what is the primary reason that this was ruled a suicide so quickly on the scene? And the first thing that was told to me, and this is actually before I reviewed the photographs, was that it was ruled a suicide because the locking mechanism on the apartment door was a deadbolt system that was only accessible from inside of the apartment, and there was no evidence. It would be impossible for someone to gain entry into the apartment, given that there was no one on the balcony and that this was a deadbolt that was locked. And so my preliminary thought was, well, I had to see the crime scene photos, because I was immediately thinking that growing up as a child, my family had the old-fashioned deadbolt system. If anyone's familiar with it, it's wildly unsafe and I don't recommend it, but it locked only from the inside. And it was a legitimate deadbolt that you had a key that you would lock from the inside. So if there was no corresponding keyhole on the outside of the door. So it truly was a sort of an old-fashioned alarm, so to speak, so that someone couldn't gain entry. And if you wanted to gain entry with the old-fashioned deadbolt system, I mean, to gain entry, you would truly have to take the door off the hinges. And I don't know that you'd have to be very, very strong to use just your body to kick in the old-fashioned deadbolt doors. You would most likely need some form of battering ram to get that door down. And so when I heard that, I thought, well, if that's true, then I would have agreed with the police department. I would have said, listen, this is a suicide. I know it's the strangest set of facts, the wildest set of facts, the most upsetting set of facts, but if this were an old-fashioned deadbolt system, then there would be no way that someone could have, if they got in, you would expect to see tremendous amount of damage to the door and the door frame. And so I looked at the crime scene photos and I saw the latching mechanism, and I said this on the network and I'll say it again. I did a quick Google search, or really a YouTube search, on is it possible to open or lock or unlock one of those sliding hotel, that's really what it is, a hotel locking mechanism. Is it possible to do that? And, within seconds, there's dozens of videos on how to do that, using a credit card, a hanger, a piece of gum, sticking the lock sort of halfway open, halfway closed, and slamming the door shut as hard as possible. In other words, there's so many different ways to lock that door from the outside. So when I found that, I said, listen, this doesn't, I'm not saying this makes it a homicide, but what I'm saying is the premise that because the door was locked from the inside, or rather locked, the locking mechanism was on the inside, doesn't make it any more a suicide than it does a homicide, meaning it doesn't mean anything without more evidence, right? So you can't hang your hat on because the door was locked from the inside. That means it must be suicide because nobody would have been able to lock it from the outside. That's nonsense. I have all the videos. Anyone could do it. You can actually test that out at a hotel. I think almost all hotels still have that old-fashioned latching mechanism. So that I said, well, then I had to keep going because that doesn't definitively answer the question for me. And so then it got to other facts that led to, well, the fact that her spinal column, at least initially, was said to not have been severed. And so I don't want to be confusing here. So you saw, and those who watched saw that the the neuropathologist who examined Ellen's portion of her spinal column concluded that it was severed. But that's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about when Ellen's body was found and brought to the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office, there was reference in the medical examiner report that a neuropathologist had conducted an examination of Ellen's spinal column, and the spinal column wasn't severed. Now, let's assume a couple of things. Let's assume that's true, okay, that an examination was done and that Ellen's spinal column was not severed. All that means that, yes, she would have been able to still physically move her body. Again, doesn't make it for me any more a suicide than a homicide necessarily. It doesn't conclusively say one thing or the other. But just like the luminol test that we spoke about earlier, if the presence of blood was found and shown to be cleaned up, conclusively a homicide. Okay, but the opposite is not true. Same thing with the medical examiner. If the spinal column isn't severed, doesn't make it a homicide or a suicide. You still have to do investigation. If it is severed, then that's what the medical examiner calls someone being rendered immediately incapacitated. In other words, they would be physically unable, incapable of moving. They'd be awake, they would be able to hear, feel, all of those things potentially, but would not be able to move their body. Okay, so then again, that makes it a homicide. Why does it make it a homicide? Because we don't know the order of the stab wounds except for one. We know the last stab wound, and the last stab wound was into the chest because that's where the knife was found, and there's no evidence that it was pulled out and put back in. So in other words, if that's the last stab wound, and at some period in terms of the stabbing, the spinal column is severed, Ellen would not have been physically capable to stab herself in the chest. Okay, so if the spinal column is severed, it has to be a homicide. Now, let's talk about the neuropathologist indication in the original file. So there's a reference to a neuropathologist doing that examination. At the time, and I'm not positive whether Philadelphia has one now or not, but when I was in homicide, the Philadelphia medical examiners did not have a neuropathologist on staff. Okay, so what they would do is they would hire a per diem neuropathologist, the same one, to do neuropathology or neuropathology autopsy when necessary or when it was appropriate given the circumstances. So I saw the passing reference. It was only a line or two in the medical examiner's report. And I said, well, wait a second, where's that report? So in other words, if someone does that type of autopsy or performs that type of procedure, there has to be a report. You can't rely on it otherwise. You know, for instance, if I were to try a homicide case and I were to say to the jury, I'm not going to call the medical examiner and I'm not going to show you a medical examiner's report. I just want you to take my word for it that one was done and it found that it was a homicide. Like that doesn't fly. You can't do that, right? So if you don't have the evidence, to me, it's not evidence. So you can't even consider it. So I said, where's the report? I need to evaluate it. I need to read it. There was no report. Okay. Well, show me the logbook that shows that this neuropathologist, who's a per diem, in other words, she gets paid per hour for doing this particular work. Show me the log that showed that she was even there to do the examination. There wasn't one. Okay. Well, show me the canceled check. Show me anything. Show how this particular doctor was paid for this examination. There wasn't any evidence that ever happened. So I said, well, listen, if you don't have all of that, you can't rely on it. So don't tell me that's some way that you concluded that this in fact was a suicide or a homicide, a suicide. You don't have the evidence. Show me the evidence and maybe I'll agree with you, but I need to see it. And 9 years later, that's never been produced. And in fact, I know that neuropathologist was reached out to, if not by Oxygen, by one of the reporters who covered the story. And she has absolutely no recollection of doing this examination. She didn't say she didn't do it. She just says she has no recollection of it. So I put that aside. If you don't have the evidence, I do all of my investigations evidence-based, not conspiracy theory-based, not, it's evidence. What is the evidence? So right now, there is no evidence originally from a neuropathologist. So the only evidence that does exist is from a current neuropathologist, who says, in fact, that the spinal column was severed. The only reason that neuropathologist was even able to do an examination to come to that conclusion is because they kept a piece or a portion of Ellen's spinal column. I'm not saying that body parts have never been kept, but I've never seen that before. You would keep a portion of the spinal column for years after someone's death that you ruled a suicide. It doesn't make any sense to me. Because if you think about it, the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office handles nearly 300 plus homicides, unfortunately, a year, plus thousands of deaths that come through the Philadelphia Medical Examiners for all host of reasons, whether it be suspicious causes, natural causes, but there's just a tremendous amount of bodies that come through the Medical Examiner's Office. imagine they kept a portion of every person's body who came through the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office. I'm not trying to be perverse here or funny, but I mean, you would need a football-sized stadium to house that many body parts. So body parts aren't kept because you wouldn't be able to house body parts for every person's body who comes through the medical examiner's office. It would just be impossible in terms of a storage. So why the body part was kept, the spinal column, I have no idea, but it was. And so that spinal column was able to be produced. The medical examiners fully cooperated with that and allowed for that to be tested by an outside forensic or neuropathologist. And the neuropathologist came to the conclusions that he came to. I've not officially seen his report, but I did hear his findings. So I can't opine on sort of my take on that. All I can tell you is that's what that neuropathologist says. And as the evidence exists right now, that is the only neuropathologist who at least has a report, who did the examination, and who can talk intelligently about what he did. So that's the evidence that we have right now, or that is existing right now, that her spinal column was severed, which means if that is in fact true, so if a jury or anyone were to believe that conclusively, Ellen would not have been able to stab herself in the chest. All right, so I put that aside when I had the neuropathology non-existing report. I questioned, of course, the turning over of the computers and all the electronic devices. But again, I didn't question it terribly hard because there was no evidence that anything was done with them. In other words, I would have questioned it more if I had a suicide report and I said, listen, how am I supposed to rely on this when the evidence was given back to civilians? And so that wasn't part of the file. So I didn't look too much into that because there was no evidence to look into other than the fact that it was strange that the devices were given in the first place. I looked at the crime scene photos with a fine-tooth comb over and over and over again. There is certainly what appears to be an absence of blood given the amount of stab wounds. Everyone bleeds differently. I will say that. I was taken aback for sure by the lack of blood, which is, again, this goes back to the luminol testing that would have been incredibly beneficial had we had that at the time. But again, like I said, it's too late. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to make sure we're clear. When there was conversations about where the phone records recovered, the text messages that Oxygen Network covered that Sam had sent to Ellen from outside the door were recovered. I don't know that there was a reason to necessarily get phone records, and I say that because no one was disputing Ellen and Sam being home, well, there's only one witness to that at the end of the day. It's him, but he was not disputing that he was home basically from early in the afternoon until the gym, until Ellen was found. So typically when you're getting phone records, it's when someone is indicating I'm somewhere else. Like I wasn't there, I came home, or I have an alibi or something like that. In other words, the phone, I was in another city, another town, or I was on a cell tower over. You would obtain the phone records to see if that person was truly in the township or area they were, because the phone would be pinging off the different towers. So I don't know that sort of the phone logs would have been necessary, only because no one was disputing who was home when. That wasn't, whether it's a homicide or a suicide, I don't know that would have been an issue in this particular case. The time frame, like I said, it was approximately an hour after Sam had returned from the gym, prior to gaining entry into the apartment and prior to calling the police. Factually, people were asking about who was present when the police arrived. I don't remember specifically whether his family was there immediately before or immediately thereafter, but his family was in fact present on scene when the police were there. Now, I just don't have a specific recollection of whether that was before the police got there or shortly thereafter, but it was close in time to when the police arrived. That I do recall from the case file. There was questions about the engagement ring. The file had indicated that the engagement ring Ellen was not wearing her engagement ring, but in fact that the engagement ring was in the bedroom, either on the nightstand or in the nightstand. At least that's what was contained in the file. There was questions about questionable gym attire, I suppose, as it relates to what type of shoes he was wearing, the fiance was wearing when he went to the gym.
What I can tell you is the security guard, and I don't remember this, I'm not clear. I'm clear on what I'm about to say. I'm not clear on where it came from. So there's a statement from the security guard, and then there's police reports that in some ways recap what either was said on the scene, or in sometimes that's recapped from what's in the statement. And so I don't know if it came directly from the security guard statement or whether it was in a police report, a narrative that was referring back to the conversation with on scene with the security guard. But in any event, what was in the police file was that in some capacity, the security guard, or at least it was related through a police report, the security guard had indicated that the fiance, as he called him, was wearing boots or something to that effect. And he took note of that because of the conversation that he had with the security guard regarding where he was prior to the door being locked, and that was the gym. And so there was a reference of him taking note of that, that the shoes didn't seem consistent with gym attire, but there wasn't a fantastic description of what those were, and the video is not clear. So all I can tell you is it's contained in the file. I don't know much more about it. There were no shoes recovered or anything like that. So that there was no showing up of the shoes to the security guard to ask him if they're the shoes he's referencing. It's just a reference that's in the file. It is what it is. I mean, there's really no description other than a line or two in the file about that particular part of the case. So let me see. There is questions about what will happen if the medical examiner changes the manner of death. Okay. So the cause of death is the stab wound to the chest. The manner of death right now is ruled a suicide. And so there's several different types of manners of death that a medical examiner can provide. They don't make them up. There's 5, and it's a checkbox. And so he could change it. It's not going to be natural causes, obviously. So he could change it to undetermined, sort of what's oftentimes referred to as suspicious causes, sometimes, or homicide, or leave it as a suicide. If he were to change it to a homicide, or he or she, I don't know why I keep saying he or she, whoever the medical examiner would be at that point in time, if that were changed to a homicide, then there would be, the case would now be an active case. It'd be a cold case for sure, because it's 9 years old at this point, but it would become an active case that would be assigned to the homicide unit, and it would be investigated, or at least should be investigated, as a homicide. If it is changed to undetermined, I don't know that there's a particular obligation on anyone's part to do any further investigation from an authority standpoint, from law enforcement standpoint. If the authorities believe that this is a suicide, regardless of what the medical examiner says, they could, I think, reasonably, from their perspective, rely on that and not do anything more. Again, the same is not true, though, if it were changed to a homicide, which was the original ruling from the medical examiner's office in Philadelphia. And again, I don't have any real good reason, because like I said, when I questioned every part of the file as it relates to whether or not this could be conclusively a suicide, I never got a good answer. So, I don't know how, I don't know how evidentiary wise this could be changed to a suicide. I suppose I could see it being changed to undetermined, given a lot of the questions that weren't answered or were not investigated. But I don't see how it can conclusively, from my review of the evidence, be changed to a suicide. I don't understand that, not from a homicide. And so that stood out to me, that wasn't done. I mean, that was done, that changed from a homicide to a suicide. That was very unusual. There was questions about a cover-up in the district attorney's office, in the police department's office. What I'll tell you is this. I have zero evidence of that, and I do not for 1 second believe that the Philadelphia district attorney's office homicide unit in any way covered anything up. And I suppose this is anecdotal, but I'll share this with you. Again, I knew nothing about this case. I started to look into it, and before I did that, I had to have the blessing of all the higher-ups, all of whom were involved in the preliminary discussions when this case first came into the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office back in 2011. I'm getting involved in 2014 or 15. And so when I go to them and I ask them out of the blue, can I review this case file? Every one of them unequivocally, knowing what type of investigations I do on cold cases and other homicides that I've worked on, gave me 100% blessing. And so again, I know this is anecdotal, but if the people I'm going to participated in the original investigation and it was a cover-up, I cannot envision a scenario in which they would have allowed me to review the file. And it would have been as simple as what wouldn't have sort of arisen any suspicion by me. All they would have had to have said is, Guy, you have, unfortunately, sadly in Philadelphia, you have 30, 40, 50 homicides, active homicides on your desk, cases scheduled for trial, motions, witnesses to interview. You have homicides sitting on your desk. This case was ruled a suicide 4 years ago. You don't have time for this. Go work on your homicides, right? I mean, that's what you would expect to see if someone was now getting nervous that they were going to be called out for some sort of conspiracy. And that didn't happen. I had the full blessing of all of my bosses at the time who I had the utmost respect for. And so I do want to sort of put that to rest. I don't believe that for a second. How this went so wrong, sometimes mistakes are made. I'm not making excuses by any stretch of the imagination. If I had been involved in day one, I truly love to believe or like to believe that this wouldn't have happened this way. I don't know that the answers that would have come out of this would necessarily make everyone happy. Obviously, no one would be happy. No one's happy as a result of this, but at least there could have been answers, right? That's the frustrating thing about this case, is that there are many cases where no matter how much investigation you do, there's sometimes just no way to solve it, and it's upsetting. But this case, we at least could have had definitive answers, right? I mean, if just certain things were done differently, we could have had definitive answers. So I can't account for that. Again, I'm not sort of removing myself from it. I mean, I wasn't there at the time, and I'm not trying to make excuses for other people, but it just wasn't done. And so now the situation that Ellen's family finds themselves in and sort of where the case is a direct result of it. There's no question about it. And it's beyond infuriating from a legal perspective, like I said in the beginning, and I can't imagine how it feels to the family, knowing that there could be answers. And again, they might not be the answers the family wanted, but at least they would have had answers. I know that there was questions about whether or not the current district attorney has any connections to or to anyone. Originally, the district attorney, Larry Krasner of Philadelphia now, the current district attorney, was originally back in 2011, 2012, he was hired by the family to represent them because they wanted answers and they weren't getting them. So they actually, when Mr. Krasner was a civil rights attorney and a criminal defense attorney, among other things, in terms of law practice, he was hired by the family, Ellen's family, to try to get answers. And he had sent a whole host of emails to the district attorney's office at the time, essentially begging them to at least let the family review the file to have the evidence to go through it. There were certain times in which the district attorney's office did allow the family to come into a round table, but my understanding is the evidence was never given. Mr. Krasner has won the election as the Philadelphia district attorney. He could have been, I suppose, in a capacity to, because the file was within his office at that time, to turn the file over to the family. I mean, a copy of it, not the actual original file, but a copy, the entire copy of the file. He did not do that. He declared a conflict of interest. And, I think legally speaking, that's the proper thing to do. I mean, he represented them in one capacity. Now he's the actual district attorney, the elected district attorney in Philadelphia. So he turned the file over when there's a conflict. So just so everyone understands, this case would fall under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Philadelphia Police Department as well as the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. The federal authorities would have no jurisdiction over this case, and the Attorney General's office would have no authority or jurisdiction over this case unless there was a conflict. And so the file was turned over from an ethical perspective by the current Philadelphia District Attorney to the Attorney General's office. So whenever there's a conflict, that's where a state conflict or a local conflict, it will go to the state Attorney General's office. And so that is who has the file now. And that's who I believe did some form of review of the file prior to the airing of the documentary on Oxygen. I thought I would keep up with all the questions. There are hundreds, if not more questions. And so I don't, how does this work? Let me see here. There's 234 comments. Okay. Questions. Let me just see if any stand out to me that I did not address. Okay. So a lot of these I addressed. Okay. What I can tell you is, again, to the extent possible, I'm happy to answer questions. I will continue to look on Justice for Ellen webpage, and to the extent that I can answer any questions or shed any light on any questions that people have that I hadn't addressed, I will be happy to do that. And again, I'm doing this simply because something should be done. And again, I don't, what that thing is specifically, well, we don't know yet, because I think more investigation needs to be done. More things need to be done. And I think specifically the forensic pathologist, the neuropathologist who reviewed the spinal column of Ellen, I think that needs to be taken into account and taken serious consideration. Now, sure, experts can differ. Maybe another expert would decide differently, but I think that at least needs to be done. I mean, whether that's a government hired forensic pathologist or neuropathologist, that needs to be done. Because again, if you have multiple experts from different sides of the fence, so to speak, agreeing that the spinal column was severed, then that's a homicide. And so if nothing else, that should be done. And so whether that will happen or not, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't represent the family, and I'm no longer a prosecutor. I'm in private practice. But that would be, where I think in terms of an investigation, that should be the focal point, because that's the be all end all in terms of a homicide. If it's not severed, doesn't make it a suicide any more than it does a homicide. But if it is severed, like the current neuropathologist is saying, it's a homicide. So I think that's where things should start. And if multiple neuropathologists agree, or really just one more, if the state or the city has one and uses one and comes to that conclusion as well, then this should be investigated very differently. And so I will leave you all with that. I thank you. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of comments. There's a tremendous amount of people who are actively involved in looking for some form or semblance of justice for Ellen, as they should. And I thank you all for the time that you took. I hope I was helpful in some way to answer the questions that came up. I hope that I shed some light on some of the things that could not be addressed by Oxygen. And again, I don't mean could not be addressed, meaning there's a time constraint, obviously, with television, with network television. And I think Oxygen did a phenomenal job in how they produced and put the program together. But I'm just happy that we have a forum where some of the things, given those time constraints, could be addressed. And I'm happy to continue to do this. I'm happy to continue to answer your questions. And if that means jumping back on another Facebook Live, I'm happy to do that. And so thank you all for joining. Thank you all for listening. And again, I hope this was in some ways informative and helpful. And if I could be of any assistance, you just let me know in terms of answering these questions and whatnot. Thank you all, and have a good night.